Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's book talk. It's a great honor and pleasure to introduce Professor Nicholas Mulder to talk about today's book, The Economic Weapon, The Rise of Sanctions as a Tool of Modern War. My name is Steve Redding. I'm here representing the Griswold Center of Economic Policy Studies on behalf of myself and Ilyana Kuzienko. And this book talk is hosted jointly with the Judas Rabinowitz Center for Public Policy and Finance, the Center for Collaborative History, and the Economic History Workshop. And it's wonderful that we can do this book talk in a hybrid format so that we can both be here in person and also reach out to people online. I know many people are viewing this online. So Nicholas received his doctorate from Columbia University, and I think this book stems from his doctoral studies. And he's a professor of history in the Department of History at Cornell University. We're particularly fortunate that he and his wife are in New York this week, so we've been able to attract him down to Princeton today for today's book talk. His fascinating book charts the evolution of sanctions as a tool of international diplomacy, from its use in wartime blockades to its more recent use as an alternative to military conflict. And in particular, the crucial role played by the interwar period between the First and Second World War in that transformation. And obviously, his book connects with many issues of great contemporary relevance today, thinking about the current Russia-Ukraine conflict and the response of NATO and other Western countries. So I think Nicholas is going to aim to talk for around 50 minutes today, and then we'll have around 30 minutes afterwards for Q&A. And I think Nicholas will stay around just outside of the auditorium for a few minutes afterwards if you'd like to get a signed copy of his book to get his signature. But without further ado, I'll hand you over now to Nicholas. And then just sort of one final thing, if you're online and would like to ask some questions, please put them in the Q&A. We'll try to pull on some of those questions for the discussion at the end of Nicholas's talk. So without further ado, handing over to you, Nicholas. Thank you again.
Thank you. Can you all hear me all right? Yes. Yeah. Thank you very much for that kind introduction. Thank you to Stephen, Dana, and Ilyana for the invitation, to the Rabinowitz Center, the Griswold Center, and the Economic History Workshop for giving me the chance to actually do the first in-person as well as online book talk. I'm happy that at least, given all the other problems in the world, that's one aspect that seems to be improving, that we can see each other in more direct settings again, which is great. So I'll talk for about 45, 50 minutes about the book. I want to present some of its main findings, and it's a particular pleasure really to do so in front of this mixed audience of economists, historians, social scientists more broadly. So I've also tweaked some aspects of the presentation to bring out those elements a little bit more. And I very much look forward to questions and discussion afterwards. So the book is a history of the origins of modern international economic sanctions in the interwar period. And it has a title, The Economic Weapon, that is actually a term that was used in the early 20th century itself. Before sanctions, as we call them today, came to be called sanctions, this term in English, it was used by American, by British, by Anglophone internationalists in the early 20th century to describe the organized use of economic pressure as a tool of politics. And that term itself became the title of the book, but it also contains an important insight, which is that the origins of sanctions lie in wartime, and in economic war in particular, and that they were conceived from the very beginning as a very powerful coercive tool. And this became the entryway for a lot of my research into this topic. And the argument that I'm going to be making today is that sanctions are actually a much more powerful force in world history in the 20th century, particularly the early 20th century, but that also means that I think they have implications for not just historians and people studying international politics and security issues, but also global macroeconomics and economic history. So that will be what the focus of my talk today will be. Oh, sorry. Oh, yeah. Thank you. I hope I didn't. Yes. So I'll talk about few aspects of the argument today. First of all, the use of economic war in the First World War, then how sanctions came to be conceived in the interwar period, in the initial period that they were first formulated and debated and used in the 1920s, and that was primarily as a deterrent. So the paradox of sanctions was that they had been used with devastating effect in the First World War, but they were actually thought of as a weapon that was so terrible that it should preferably not be used at all, and that the pure threat of its use would suffice to solve international security crises. We've just been through a period, right, of about 3-4 months prior to the Russian invasion of Ukraine, where again that was attempted to outline sanctions as a deterrent. And I'm very happy to go further into the theory of that as well. But that's one aspect that was already present 100 years ago. And interestingly, there were some notable successes, but they were successes under very specific conditions. And that also, I think, tells us something about how sanctions can work very well under certain conditions and not so well under others. So timing, circumstances, the global economic and political environment matter tremendously. I'll also talk about how sanctions interacted with, of course, a major economic historical event of the early 20th century, the Great Depression. And more broadly, this big debate going on right now about are the war in Ukraine and these sanctions going to lead to deglobalization? That's a debate that economic historians who've charted the rise and fall phases of globalization since the 19th century have had. But there hasn't been that much sustained attention to the role of the organized use of economic coercion within that. There has, of course, been interest in tariffs, in protectionism. I'll talk a little bit about the interaction between sanctions and tariffs and why they are importantly different in certain ways. They do both impose costs in an economic sense, but they do not necessarily produce the same kind of politics or the same kind of ideology. And I want to use this one test case for a variety of reasons, the Italo-Ethiopian War, the most important case in which sanctions were used in the interwar period by the League of Nations against an aggressor state. And that's also an example in a case that's really ripe, I think, with implications for the present and lessons, both positive and negative, for our current moment. And finally, I'll talk a little bit about the unintended consequences of sanctions. This too is important, again, by embedding sanctions and the way that they worked into economic history more generally and the tendencies towards globalization and deglobalization. I think we can also provide somewhat of a reinterpretation of the escalation into the Second World War. There were many factors that played into that. I won't have time to do justice to all of them today, but sanctions, I think, are an important one that haven't received the attention that they deserve. And then I'll finalize with a few broad conclusions, and I look forward to the discussion. But let's start really with the point of origin of this new way of thinking about how to use economic pressure between states. This is the First World War, the Great War, which ends what economic historians call the first great age of globalization from the mid-19th century up until 1914. And one of the striking things about the First World War is that it broke out in a world that was incredibly globalized in commercial terms, in terms of finance, in terms of the movement of people across borders. And you have here a map of the main European theater of the First World War within the darker shades, the two central powers, Germany and Austria-Hungary. And on either side of them, the Entente, which later became the Allies when the United States joined, France, Britain, Russia, and a number of smaller countries. And the experience of this war produced confidence that by using economic isolation, it was possible to move world politics in a desirable direction, to compel certain powerful industrial states to a settlement, and also to have an instrument afterwards that could potentially discipline them and prevent them from engaging in the kind of aggression that had produced the war. And the policy that really originated, the policy that lay at the origins of this was the use of economic blockade. So during the First World War, beginning in the first few weeks of the war already, the British and French governments began to collaborate on a far-reaching attempt to interdict all the trade routes, all the various forms of shipping and transport that feed commodities and resources to Central Europe, to their opponents, the Central Powers. And this was an effort that took place in this world economy that was highly privatized. It was quite difficult to actually have an overview of what was going on. There was a big epistemic problem, a big knowledge gathering problem, because the 19th century state was by and large a fairly laissez-faire state. It didn't necessarily have that much of an understanding of what was going on in its own borders. It had some sense of trade statistics, but this was very much a labor of construction, of having to build institutions that could map the flows between countries. So for the first 2-3 years of the war, there's a big effort to build out the blockade effort against the Central Powers into a real bureaucracy. And the fact that this was considered really important, we can find from the fact that Britain actually erected a full ministry of blockade. So this was a full cabinet level position, fully on par with some of the other ministries like munitions and shipping. And And the Ministry of Blockade was a ministry dedicated to the pursuit of economic warfare against the Central Powers. And this, by the end of the war, involved many thousands of civil servants, an intelligence network of consuls, of agents all over the world, from Latin America to East Asia, gathering intelligence on the trade and financial links that the Central Powers had with the rest of the world. And it had a potentially powerful profile that could be exploited in the aftermath of the war by the victors. So over the course of the war, and particularly in its last 2 years, this instrument and the instrument of blockade begins to be called the economic weapon. This is very much with an eye to the future also. You can see on the left a table of the raw materials that were controlled by the Allies and the Central Powers, the raw amounts in the two columns on the left, and then on the right, the percentages that each had. I've also here included in the share of the Central Powers the territories in Eastern Europe, particularly the western part of the Russian Empire, that fell eventually under the control or de facto economic domination of Germany after the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. And you can see that of all of this entire list, the Allies had a really vast majority of key global raw materials. There were only 5, and I've circled them in red here, that actually were a majority on the side of the Central Powers: barley, rye, beet sugar, flax, and manganese. So certainly important materials, but not something that you could really build a potentially war-winning coalition on top of. On the right, you can see a map of the first countries that were considered for membership in the League of Nations. So in the final few months of the war, it begins to dawn on the Allies that if you are able to use this integrated Allied blockade system in the future, in peacetime, and you use this as effective, a world kind of oligopoly on key resources, or world monopoly even on certain resources, you have the ability to dictate terms to countries that threaten the peace in the future. This is the original insight that leads to the creation of economic sanctions. And the effort in the interwar period effectively becomes to try and expand the coalition of countries inside the League of Nations to be part of this sanctionist coalition. I see that it's basically loading everything at the same time. So just give me some time to walk you through all the points here. No problem. The way also, I think it's useful to kind of define terms, right? How do I understand sanctions? How do I define them in the particular way that they emerged here? And it's important just to note that for a large part of history, all the way back to antiquity in the Middle Ages, it was normal to use material pressure against civilians, to blockade, to use sieges, deprive people of resources for political ends. That's a very old practice. What is new about the kind of economic sanctions that the League of Nations creates is that you can coercively isolate entire societies and economies in peacetime. So this becomes part of the armory, effectively, of peacetime foreign policy instruments. And traditionally, it was possible to use this sort of severe pressure against civilians, but as long as you declared war, it was considered part of war. Blockade was a policy you could only engage in if you declared war. And as soon as there was an armistice or a ceasefire, you were required to lift the blockade. So there was a quite clear separation, particularly throughout the 18th and 19th centuries in international law, that this was how international economic relations and the international interstate sphere of war and peace interacted with each other. But this changed when the League of Nations was created in 1918, 1919 at the Paris Peace Conference. And in Article 16 of the Covenant of the League of Nations, there was now for the first time a provision that countries that in the future would break peace and would violate treaties would have the League of Nations coalition sever access to resources as a punishment. And the idea that this mechanism was there was thought to be sufficient to deter them from doing it at all. So that was the deterrent theory of economic sanctions. There's a number of interesting implications that followed from this, and I already mentioned a few of them, but many of them have to do with the fact that sanctions are a very severe form of economic intervention in the global economy. And I think it's just important to pause and reflect on what that actually means for the kind of state that you need, the kind of policymaking apparatus that's required. This was not the kind of policymaking state that existed in the 19th century. The war had created this ministry of blockade, this new bureaucracy, and the hope of many people in the wake of World War I was that there would be a return to the 19th century world of free trade, the gold standard, laissez-faire, and with that came expectations of a fairly minimalist state, at least in the realm of economic intervention in many areas. Sanctions, however, require precisely the opposite, right? Intelligence in order to be able to map flows that can be cut off and interdicted. They require the ability also to control key resources and to coordinate with other states, which countries get them and which do not. In other words, dictating terms to private companies and really allowing the state to use a certain degree of suasion over business that it didn't have in many ways in the 19th century. And finally, they require very significant changes in international law, because in order to make a sanctions regime or an economic blockade effective and hermetic, and this is something, right, that's very actual at this very moment, it's necessary to make sure that not just countries participating in sanctions, but third countries that are not part of the sanctioning coalition do not provide a source of trade diversion. And international law for much of the early modern period and way into the 19th and early 20th century protected very strongly the possibility of countries to choose to be neutral. The United States had been neutral all the way up until 1917 and had been trading with the Central Powers. And there were many countries, particularly smaller European countries, so Scandinavian states, Switzerland, the Netherlands, that had also traditionally had a strong attachment to this sort of neutrality. In order to make sanctions effective and hermetic, this neutrality had to be rendered, if not impossible, then at least much more difficult. So there's basically a tendency to force countries to take sides in the interest of the total hermetic economic logic. And this has significant consequences. And it's not really until after 1945 that neutrality, particularly in wars of aggression, comes to be really stigmatized. And I think that's where much of our more modern moral sensibility also, right, about countries continuing to trade with aggressor states comes from. But that was not actually a widespread perception at all in the early 20th century. And it took many decades, and it took decades of efforts by the proponents of sanctions to make that morality the intuition that it is to us today, to kind of politicize trade with aggressor states negatively. So the original goal of sanctions, this is also something that's important to be clear about. Today we use sanctions for a really wide variety of things, stopping nuclear proliferation, pressing for the release of political prisoners, to punish human rights violations, enforce all sorts of norms, even political and environmental ones, sometimes even to try and force a change of regime, a change in political character of countries. None of these goals actually were possible uses of sanctions in the early 20th century. The only really strictly defined possible goal for which sanctions could be used was to stop, either prevent or stop an ongoing interstate war. It was only for the protection of territorial integrity, violation of treaties, or violation of the norm against aggression between states. There was a very narrow set of conditions that triggered the use of sanctions. Internal politics, whatever a country did, whatever the nature of its politics was, whatever it did to its own population, were not considered relevant at all to whether a country could suffer from sanctions or would have sanctions imposed against it. So that too, I think it's important to emphasize today. Liberal internationalism has a much more, I think, expansive definition of what sanctions can and should be used for. It was very narrow in the early 20th century. There was one goal that briefly was added to this interstate, anti-interstate aggression goal, and that was trying to push for political change. But it was something that emerged very briefly after World War I, and then was essentially quashed for most of the interwar period, and didn't really reemerge until the 40s with the Cold War, when sanctions came to be used much more to pursue goals of political and regime change. The early post-war period, so 1917 to 1921, Woodrow Wilson, it's appropriate, I guess, in this building, formerly the Woodrow Wilson School, to talk a little bit about this. Woodrow Wilson was one of the few figures who started to attach, towards the end of World War I, explicitly political conditions to the continued imposition of sanctions and to their lifting. So he said actually that Imperial Germany, the Reich, would not regain access to world markets unless it become a democracy. He also said the same thing towards the Soviet Union. Unless the Soviet Union honor treaties and international debts and contracts, it would not be admitted into the intercourse of free nations. So he made very clear conditions that dealt with internal economic and political institutions, but crucially, The United States, with his agenda, did not join the League of Nations, and Wilson died in the early 20s. So therefore, this never became an official stated use of sanctions in the interwar period. But of course, the advent of American hegemony in the late 40s did allow those goals to expand quite tremendously. So one of the really striking things about the use of sanctions is that they require a really iron logical consistency, particularly if the deterrent effect of them is meant to work. And the League of Nations, an association, an organization that we usually associate with humanitarianism, with lots and lots of talking, debating, and rather inefficacious diplomacy, perhaps, was really quite adamant and insistent on the fact that sanctions had to hit a civilian population in its entirety. So one of the officials whose records I found in the League of Nations archives in Geneva, this is a really crystalline statement, I think, of the logic of using this tool of total economic war in peace precisely to prevent war. He said, it's the starvation of the general population, and in particular of the poorest people, which is likely to cause such trouble in the aggressor state that it must give way. And I think personally that we should make sanctions as automatic and as terrible to the entire government fighting force and civil population of the aggressor state. I think that the more successful we are in making life in the aggressor state intolerable to the ordinary man and woman, and he adds in woman here with a pen, because this is actually a response to a feminist political organization criticizing the total nature of League sanctions and making an argument for humanitarian carve-outs for women and children. But the League pushes back and says, no, the ordinary man and woman need to be targeted. The more likely we are in a modern democratic state to break down the resistance of the recalcitrant state, or indeed prevent a potential aggressor from becoming recalcitrant. So again, like the stigmatization and the steady erosion of neutrality, carve-outs weaken sanctions in this logic. Total blockade is more effective. And this is a striking thing, because this is really not the sort of story that we're used to thinking about when we think about international law, humanitarianism, the story of international organizations in the early 20th century. But it is one that has a certain logic to it, but it is made very explicit in moments like this. And interestingly, this deterrent model of launching total economic war effectively in peace to prevent war has some notable successes. There are at least two cases in the 1920s where just the threat of sanctions suffices actually to diffuse a potentially quite dangerous geopolitical crisis. Both of them are in the Balkans, and this might seem relatively insignificant in the bigger scheme of power politics, but we shouldn't forget that World War I began in the Balkans. So at this time, this was considered to be a real geopolitical flashpoint. Any war that started here and that was left to sort of simmer had the potential to escalate and get out of bounds very quickly. So the League was extremely focused on these sort of incidents. One of them was an early border war between Yugoslavia, recently created by the Treaty of Versailles, and northern Albania, created a few years earlier. And the Yugoslavs invaded northern Albania and tried to annex certain parts of this border region, because the border hadn't yet been determined by international treaty. In response, the League of Nations issued a threat that there would be an Article 16 sanctions procedure against Yugoslavia. And within a few weeks, the Yugoslav dinar fell on the London money market. The Yugoslavs realized they're a landlocked country. They needed access to the seas. The British, particularly with the Royal Navy making this sort of threat, had serious means to enforce it. And they gave way, and there was an international border commission that set the border, and it diffused this conflict. So that was one important success. The second case happened 4 years later on the border between Greece and Bulgaria. This is an incident with a very colorful name, the War of the Stray Dog. I think you can all imagine how a stray dog has the potential, when not well behaved, to cause a border war. But it was basically a Greek sentry whose dog ran across the Bulgarian border, or maybe it was the other way around, a Bulgarian sentry whose dog ran across the Greek border. An exchange of gunfire led to a very tense situation, and before long, the Greeks actually had mobilized several army divisions and were in the process of crossing the border and bombarding Bulgarian towns. And again, the League of Nations acted very quickly, and within the space of about a week, issued a very clear threat to Athens and said, if you continue with this and if you don't accept international mediation, we're going to entirely cut off the Greek economy from access to the outside world. Greece in the 19th century had already had this sort of gunboat diplomacy used against it, so they were particularly sensitive to it. And you can see here the Greek military dictator at the time, Theodoros Pangalos, who backed down rather quickly. So these were important successes, and interestingly, they've largely escaped the attention of historians because sanctions were never used. This is, I think, one of the first things that we must really insist on. In order to really understand sanctions as a tool, they have a virtual or a prospective use that could be as important and maybe have even more tangible political effects than their real-world material application. So we need to broaden the definition of what counts as use. A serious threat is use of sanctions too. That needs to be put in our databases. But it's sometimes when people look at the early 20th century, they only look at the League of Nations sanctions against Italy because those were the only cases where they were actually implemented. But these cases showed that hopefully actually no one would have to suffer. It was simply the humbled ego of this general in Greece and a slightly depreciated Yugoslav currency. That was the entire price that would have to be paid. So it seemed actually that this might indeed be a much more humane weapon that could avoid war with much less damage. And I think it's important to really emphasize that, to show why there was so much confidence in the potency of sanctions at the time. So this picture did begin to change in the 1930s, however. I'll say a few things here about the Great Depression, because this is an audience with many economists in it. One of the assumptions that we might have is that the Great Depression automatically destroyed the potential for sanctions because it was a period of deglobalization, trade collapsed massively, and while certainly the Great Depression posed many challenges, it's very important to be specific about what we mean when we say that there was a crisis of world trade. In price levels, there was this very serious collapse. World trade between 1929 and 1932 collapses by price, and about 2/3 of its value is lost. If, however, you look at the actual volume of world trade, there's a smaller reduction. So it's only about a 1/3 reduction in volume. In the 1920s, and this is very recent data from a great Spanish economic history database, Federico and Tena Yorguito, at the bottom left, you see this table where it's very clear that the actual growth of world trade, particularly right after World War I from 1919 to 1929, was really, really significant. There was this very serious catch-up that took place for at least a decade. In fact, a growth rate higher than any of that in the 19th century, so really a catch-up to a previous level. And then when the Depression hit, that's the second kind of kink downwards in the graph that you can see on the left. There was certainly a collapse, but again, it was quite short-lived. And then from 1933-34 onwards, world trade again begins to recover. And in fact, there were only 2 years of the 1930s in which the actual volume of world trade was below its 1913 level. 1913 is conventionally understood as the high mark of the first great era of globalization. So this, I think, qualifies somewhat the idea that the 20s and even the 30s were all about deglobalization. Certainly they were, but we must reckon with the fact that in terms of the actual raw amount of goods, resources, and even people crossing borders, there was still a lot of interaction. So the reason that I go into this is that for the possibilities of using sanctions, the key implication of all of this is that despite a wave of protectionism, a collapse in world trade, and even monetary disintegration, right, the collapse of the gold standard, the potential to exploit material interdependence was actually quite undiminished, remained very strong, because there was just a lot of physical stuff still crossing borders that countries really needed in order to run their economies and societies. So interestingly, the people who were most aware of this were the potential aggressors themselves, the revisionist states. So the Minister of Foreign Exchange and Currencies, which is itself a sign that exchange rate management was thought to be very important in the wake of the collapse of the gold standard, particularly so by countries that had to build up these reserves and impose capital controls. Mussolini's Minister of Foreign Exchange and Currency, Felice Guarnieri, he wrote in 1935 something very interesting and pretty important for the discussion around sanctions, which is that most countries, even in the wake of the nadir of the Great Depression, were protectionist as producers, but remained free traders as consumers. And what he meant by that is that, right, the imposition of tariffs and tariff laws mean that you shield domestic producers from competition, but that doesn't protect you against sanctions that sever your access to vital imports, right? Many countries would have highly protected markets, but would still require things like coal, iron ore, and all sorts of fuels, food from other places. And in fact, the very collapse of prices, the global deflation of the Depression, made it much cheaper to buy all these commodities on world markets. So on the import side of countries, they remained highly vulnerable, and it was even cheaper than before in the mid and late 1930s to get resources from abroad. So this is really vital for the story of sanctions, and it should qualify the idea that because of the Depression, sanctions failed or there was no more basis to use them. It's really important to distinguish here the consumption and production side of these economies. So if you look at the table on the left, there's another effect, which is just, again, kind of moving on from the table I showed you earlier during the First World War. The countries in the League of Nations control among the 28 so-called key minerals of commerce, which is a category used widely at the time by international investors, controlled still a pretty substantial share, at least a half of these crucial commodities before and still after the Great Depression. The Great Depression did very little to diminish their actual control over these resources, as you can see from this graph. It only fell from about 53.5% to slightly above 52%. Meanwhile, the crucial revisionist powers, the countries that would have likely face sanctions if they pushed aggressively for territorial conquest and revision of the treaties, only barely increased their control over resources. It's a very largely here a story driven by Japan, for example, which more than doubles it by acquiring Manchuria and its resources. But still, the League of Nations, even in 1936, has 4 times the share of world resources that this coalition of the anti-Comintern and later Axis powers has. So this all really raises the question, why, given this still very substantial preponderance in a material heft, did the League nonetheless fail as a security institution to prevent World War II? Why did it not use this power that it very clearly still possessed despite the Depression? The issue here and the argument of the book is that we need to revise a very old canar, a very old commonplace in the literature that was introduced by one of the key texts of international relations, E.H. Carr's The 20 Years Crisis. E.H. Carr made the argument, this is also the book that's very largely responsible for creating the modern dichotomy between idealism and realism in political science and IR. But one of Carr's arguments was that the League of Nations was basically weak. It failed to have a substantial military backstop to any of its economic threats, and therefore no one took it seriously. So none of this material power really mattered. And this has been a very dominant interpretation, right? When we think of the League of Nations, we usually mention it sort of sadly before we talk about the post-1945 liberal international order. It went wrong once, World War II happened, and then we truly learned when we got the Bretton Woods institutions, the United Nations, American hegemony, and a far more integrated set of alliances, things like NATO, the EU, the OECD, etc. So that story is, of course, broadly speaking, those are all important reasons why the post-1945 period had stability that the interwar period lacked. But the idea that the League failed because it was weak is wrong. It certainly failed, but not necessarily because it was weak, rather because it was very difficult to calibrate precisely how strong the sanctions had to be deterrents or actually compellents to prevent aggression. And this was because sanctions had their origin in an incredibly powerful tool of economic war. So they always, particularly with the memory of the blockade of World War I still very fresh in everyone's minds, they always had the chance, if pushed too far, to create a situation that to the target was tantamount to war, indistinguishable from war, and that would actually lead to an escalation into open war, defeating their purpose. People at the time were very aware of this, so they tried to calibrate this intensity of the sanctions to avoid this while still having the desired effect. But this is right where the problem emerged. So the basically problem of using sanctions in the 30s was not that sanctions were weak and meant nothing. It was rather that they actually had significant strength, but had to be calibrated precisely right for the optimum political effect. So potentially, actually, it was strength and not weakness, or at least just as much strength as weakness. That was the real issue. And this is where it's worth really going into the major use of sanctions in the mid-30s, the Italo-Ethiopian War. And the first thing to note here is that this episode, right, which is usually and understandably seen as the moment where the League of Nations truly failed as a collective security institution, was preceded by a period of several months in which Mussolini, the fascist Italian dictator, was very overtly building up an army in East Africa to invade Ethiopia, very eerily reminiscent of some of the buildup that we've seen in Eastern Europe over the last year. However, there was an open question, a very strategic one among the liberal countries. Should the League focus on enforcing the treaties and enforcing the protection of League members by punishing an invasion of Ethiopia with sanctions, i.e. acting economically against Mussolini, or should it keep its powder dry, so to speak, for a potentially much larger, more powerful aggressor, namely Germany? This is a problem of priorities, and the Mussolini v. Hitler debate, we have since, of course, ultimately fascism became a kind of general threat, but in the 30s, Mussolini and Hitler, for much of it, did not get along well at all. There was the potential that they might go to war over Austria, actually, and so there was a lot of potential to play them off against each other at the time, which made this question of who to target with sanctions quite an acute one. The military buildup in Italy was by Italy was so overt. It involved ferrying hundreds of troop ships with thousands of troops through the Suez Canal, over international waterways controlled by Britain and France, actually, really before the eyes of the world. By the summer of 1935, even in the neutralist United States, you have the Washington Post and the New York Times writing articles for their readers explaining how League sanctions are going to work when Italy invades Ethiopia. So the idea that the League of Nations was caught by surprise by this episode also is wrong. It was incredibly on top of this issue, and there were, for months beforehand, debates in Western capitals, particularly London and Paris, what sort of sanctions would work. The issue here was, again, this issue of calibration and deterrence, particularly because they wanted, of course, to restrain Mussolini from engaging in aggression, but they were also still interested in keeping Mussolini as a long-term ally against Hitler, potentially, and giving him the opportunity to normalize relations again. And this led to a debate, because there were old policymakers, particularly in Britain, in the Admiralty, in the Committee of Imperial Defense, the highest strategic decision-making body, who had took their cues from the wartime blockade in World War I and advocated a direct cut-off of vital commodities to Italy: oil, coal, iron ore, scrap metal for the steel industry, and really forced the Italian economy to just ground to a halt. And Italy imported about 98% of its energy needs in this period. So that was potentially a very powerful economic sanction. But this Admiralty theory, a severance of vital imports, came to be supplemented and in fact displaced by another theory about how sanctions were supposed to work. And in my book, I call this the Treasury theory, because of the fact that it was designed not by military staffers focused on commodity control, but by economists working for the British Treasury and the Bank of England. And what they realized is that there are all sorts of commodities that one can create scarcity in, oil, coal, etc. But in this post-gold standard world, in a world where a large part of the world was now no longer using the same means of payment, there was a lot of barter trade, quota systems. Actually, hard currency reserves themselves were a scarce resource. It was difficult for countries to actually save up these reserves. Britain and the United States, the dollar, the pound sterling, and the French franc as well remained kind of hard currencies that were freely usable in the kind of Atlantic world. But for other countries, it was actually quite difficult to have enough of these. So the Treasury theory thought that Italy had a weakness in its foreign exchange reserves that could be targeted. And the way to do this is to prevent Italy from actually generating export revenues, from earning foreign currency by exporting to other countries. So what had to be done was not to actually sever any crucial imports for Italy. It was to actually ban Italian products from all the League of Nations markets and make sure that it could no longer earn any foreign exchange. And then within a few months, it was thought by these economists, the Italian war chest will effectively be empty, and Mussolini would confront a choice between continuing to fund this very expensive military expedition in Africa, which was really significant. The army that Italy sent is the largest European army ever sent to the African continent in 1935, of 500,000 troops and supporting staff. So this was an incredibly expensive venture for a country of Italy's level of prosperity. And the Treasury theory thought that, targeting foreign exchange reserves, it forces a choice between the military and the civilian outlays. Sooner or later, Mussolini must focus on supplying his own economy, and he cannot continue to fund this war machine because it's so extended a maritime supply lines and funded by foreign exchange earnings. So once these sanctions were put in place, because they followed the Treasury theory, the League did, and not the Admiralty theory, time emerged as the crucial constraint in the sanctions regime. And effectively, a race began once Mussolini invaded in October 1935 between the speed of the Italian advance, between armored columns surging through Ethiopia, very big distance actually, almost 1,000 kilometers from the border with Eritrea to Addis Ababa on the one hand, and the drain that the League sanctions could impose on the Italian foreign exchange reserves. And it was effectively these two variables that were being monitored very much in real time. And the expectation was that Italy, it was known Italy had about 450 million pounds in dollars actually, fewer in pounds, about 108 million pounds in foreign exchange reserves. That was thought to last it anywhere between 9 and 15 months. And Ethiopia was considered simply too large a country, it's the largest country in East Africa, to conquer within the space of one single campaigning season with summer rains. So it seemed like this attritional theory would work. Deterrence theory had failed against Mussolini, but attrition through this foreign exchange draining strategy, people had the hopes that it would work. Of course, as is well known, the Italians captured Addis Ababa and defeated the Ethiopian resistance before these sanctions drained foreign exchange reserves, and Mussolini got away with this. So the issue of calibration here again is really poignant, I think, that precisely the sort of light touch sanctions that are cut quite deeply into a crucial vulnerability, but are also arranged so as to keep open the road to a negotiated settlement and potentially reintegration, then they leave the road open to a peaceful solution or a de-escalation, but also enable a really determined aggressor to kind of make a run for it. And Mussolini in the end won this particular gamble to the great and everlasting discredit of the League. So the final thing that I'll talk about now is how this all fits in with the story of the origins of World War II. And I don't want to push this too far. I should really emphasize, right, that the origins of World War II are a huge and extremely complex and interrelated set of events. Many of these factors, some of them go back quite a while to the end of the First World War. Many of them have a deeply internal ideological element, particularly when it comes to fascism. But what was really noticeable was that this League of Nations sanctions regime, which has always been thought of as a failure, nonetheless had a very important impact on the thinking, on the ideology, and on the strategic outlook of other fascist and militarist regimes, particularly Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan. On the top left, you can see this Italian counter-sanctions and anti-sanzionista, so an anti-sanctions mobilization posters that describe itself as an anti-sanctionist triptych. So this is basically what Italians under fascism should sort of almost do as a daily liturgy under sanctions. They should bring their gold and their jewelry, if they are women, rings, gold bracelets, etc., to the states to increase Italy's gold reserves because they will be smelted. They should bring scrap metal, so young boys would be sent around the country to ravage, anything from pots and pans to old bicycles would be used for scrap metal, and finally to donate their savings to war loans. So a national mobilization campaign against the sanctions. And Mussolini's regime, which had been very faithful actually on the gold standard regime for many years, liberal economic policy for much of the 1920s, turns decisively inward and mobilizes around this idea of autarky. Just to the right of that, you can see a poster that Hitler and the Nazi regime made in the summer of 1936, when Hitler, right as the sanctions against Italy were being imposed, moved also German economic policy, as economic historians are now agree, onto a new footing, moved away from a more sort of moderate integration regime under the Reichsbank chairman Hjalmar Schacht to a much more imports substituting autarkic regime. And the strategy here was the 4-year plan. So this poster asked the German people to give Hitler 4 years' time. The 4 years were 4 years to prepare for war, but crucially, there was an 18-month target to become totally independent in energy supply. And this was a very direct response to the League of Nations' clear discussions of an oil embargo against Italy. So even though it failed to stop Mussolini, it still had an important effect in accelerating the timeline for the achievement of autarky to go to war for Germany. And on the right, you can see two maps that were part of German propaganda efforts in the United States that was neutral in 1940 and 41 in English, that make the claim that Germany, after these 4 years, by 1940, had achieved actually a sort of greater economic zone, particularly of friendly states in Eastern Europe from which it could source vital imports. It had unequal trade relations with them. The economist Albert Hirschman wrote a very great book on the structure of foreign economic power, using this as a test case. But there was an important geopolitical rationale here, which was that Germany needed protected sources of supply on the European continent that could be brought to Germany by river trade or railroad and could not be interdicted by the Royal Navy. So that was, again, an important thing. Germany moves to using its coal reserves in an incredibly expensive process, turning its coal reserves into oil, unbelievably wasteful process that, again, only makes sense. The energy invested in it only makes sense when you are ideologically determined that you cannot risk having your oil supplied overseas, where the Royal Navy, again, can cut it off. And finally, at the bottom here, I also want to bring in Japan. It's probably the best known story about how the economic embargoes against Japan had a role to play in the wider escalation and outbreak of the war between Western powers and Japan in the Pacific by 1941. But Japan here was, of all these countries, probably the most vulnerable because it is an island, it's very poor in resources, and it was dependent on maritime supply for many crucial raw materials. And Japan, rather than back down, became more and more desperate to secure resources. This was one of the reasons that it launched a very aggressive imperialist war in China in the early 30s that is expanded in 1937 against Chiang Kai-shek. And as it does so, Japan becomes ever more dependent, ironically, on imports from the British Empire and particularly the United States, because the United States was the only country that remained neutral after 1939. Britain uses its empire and closes it off and prioritizes resources within its empire. The United States is the only market that is relatively unrestricted in late 39, 40, and 41 that Japan can still buy from. So Japan becomes more and more dependent on sourcing its oil, steel, and other raw materials from the United States, nickel and zinc as well from the American West and mines in Nevada. You can see that here in this great paper by Harada. And this ultimately leads to an escalatory decision for war in the fall of 1941 when the United States, together with Britain and the Dutch East Indies, declares a general oil embargo and an asset freeze against Japan's overseas assets. Britain, the Netherlands, and the United States, because they have the world's major oil companies at that time, control about 90% of the world's petroleum supply. So this is a really crippling international embargo. And this is one of the major factors that make Japan decide to escalate into a wider war. So this spiral was, of course, the very opposite of what sanctions intended to do. And there were many attempts to also by internationalists who saw that these things were going the wrong way to warn and say that maybe sanctions should be calibrated differently. But ultimately, this is, I think, one of the major lessons is unintended consequences of this kind are significant. And I'll just finish with three very broad lessons that I think follow from this story in some sense. One is that we must understand the stakes and the power and the severity of sanctions when pushed to their logical and material extreme. Sanctions are a product of the era of total war, not a form of enlightened, soft overcoming of it. They can be soft measures, they can be very symbolic, but in their original philosophy and in their original design, they originate at this moment of great violence, and they are based on logics that are quite similar to that of aerial bombardments and the mass use of force in other realms. So secondly, I think political science and IR and economics are always rightfully interested in generalizable findings about efficacy, big end studies. One of the things that I think is important is not that that is necessarily a futile search, not at all, but it is very important to be kind of case-by-case specific and to take into consideration timing, the moment also in the global economic conjuncture. I think it's really crucial to be aware of the global economic backdrop to figure out what sort of moment in economic history are we in right now, were we in when sanctions were imposed against other countries, and how does that affect their efficacy? It can enhance it, but it can also really weaken it by making these trade-offs much more significant. And finally, this is a more disciplinary point, but one which I think, particularly in this interdisciplinary setting, is a very nice one to end on. It's that political economy, which is the heart of the story that I tell in the book, is essential, and it explains much, but not all. And that's part of where the unintended consequences of sanctions come in and are so tremendous. Culture, historical memory, and ideology and strategy also really play into this. And countries tell stories about themselves. They can submit to these measures. It can appeal to a certain basic economic rationality, and that is, in many cases, something that we can use. But in other cases, that is not the case. And we have to try and figure out what the risks are of this backfiring. And some circumstances and some countries and regimes are simply much more amenable to this pressure than others. So tying sanctions very much to a sort of generalizable rule risks, I think, a very dramatically divergent outcomes when focusing on the individual cases is more useful. So yeah, I'll end on that plea for holism, but thank you very much for your attention. I look forward to the questions.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. We have some time for questions.
Thanks. It's a brilliant talk, and it's an absolutely terrific book, very, very important and innovative book. I wanted to press you a bit on the, one of the core theses that is the sanctions that really accelerate the drive to World War II. And particularly, I think the German case is at the core of that. In the Japanese case, I completely agree with you.
Mm-hmm.
That's a very, very clear case where the sanctions are just terribly mistaken. But in the German case, I wonder about the drive to autarky, because in many ways, the autarky can never really be accomplished. They can't be self-sufficient in iron ore. They can't be self-sufficient in rubber. They have ingenious processes for both of those, but it's not enough. And so the way I thought a better way of having the kind of argument that you want to make would be to say that it suggests that with the presence of sanctions, the only kind of war that kind of country can fight is a very short war. And so it goes then. I mean, there's a long literature on the Blitzkrieg tradition.
Right, yes.
And whether it's in German or Prussian military thought or not. But the Blitzkrieg doesn't have these constraints, and that you can run out of fuel. And indeed, the German army ran out of fuel after the Polish invasion in September 1939. Nobody realized that in France. So you can do that as long as you have short, successful wars. But you cannot fight a long war on that principle. And the Germans really never got to the stage when they could think of fighting a long war. And when they tried to do that, it was very, very late in the day. And so that was my main question. But I had a little secondary one. That there's a kind of vaguer use of sanctions in some other way that are not called sanctions, financial measures. And particularly blocking countries from taking out loans in your currency, or floating loans on your market. And I wondered whether you didn't have in the 1930s a sort of very, very obvious issue of the question of priorities, because in 1932, Britain and France defaulted on part of their interallied debt. So the consequence was that the United States passed an act that said you couldn't, if you defaulted, raise money on the American market, and it really makes it difficult for France. But, that is a clear case where the priorities are just wrong. I mean, it's even worse than the Italian case. I think that the Italian case is bad as well, but the priorities, I think we made that point very well. So I think those two questions.
Yeah, thank you. Do you want to take more, or?
Maybe respond.
Yeah. Well, thank you very much for those two questions. I should say I agree with you actually on the German case, and I didn't really have time to go into the specifics, but you're totally right that what this does is that it forces a choice for armament in breadth rather than in depth. basically, yeah, as having lots and lots of fighting power across the spectrum, but no supplies to sustain a long war. But there are a few other things, and I think that synthetic fuel is one of them, that are very good precisely because of their incredibly uneconomical nature. If you have any ability to get this more cheaply, why would you not get it as cheap as possible so you have all these resources available to build armaments? The synthetic fuel program of Nazi Germany draws resources away from its ability to arm, right? It's an incredible drain. It actually impedes some of the expansive plans to build a world-beating navy and a massive air force that could reach the United States, because instead they're trying to dig brown coal out of Saxony and turn it into pretty bad quality oil that still, yeah, makes your tanks stop in the middle of the field. So those sort of uneconomical choices, I think, need to be explained by some sort of ulterior strategic or ideological priority. And the fact that the choice is made, and there is of course already an investment for a long time, but the real choice to commit massive resources to this is made in the spring of 1936, right around the time when there's much chatter in the Italian and German diplomatic in their circles that sanctions, and particularly an oil embargo on Italy, are a sword of Damocles that hangs over both countries. But I agree with you, and particularly I think the escalatory spiral there is precisely, like you said, because autarky is inherently, for a country as complex and large as Germany, unattainable. So every new conquest, when Czechoslovakia is taken or Austria is annexed, actually expands the number of people that need to be fed and the amount of energy that needs to be spent as well. And the problem is that Europe as a continent, as we are very aware of right now with Russia, Europe is an energy deficit, an energy importing continent. It is in 1940 and it is in 2022. So even when, after the summer of 1940, Germany seems to be in control of the European continent, it still must go after Caucasian oil, precisely because it is fearful of being severed from global oil supplies, and that Stalin might, which he does at some points in the 1930s, throttle oil supplies. So it's precisely that every new conquest leads to new supply problems, and this drives the regime forward to its inevitable destruction and defeat, but through a cycle of ever increasing escalations. And the second one, the second point you made is, yeah, I agree, and I hadn't even thought actually of the inter-allied debt provisions, but one of the remarkable things is that there is, of course, a tradition. Also, Bismarck in the 19th century, the Lombard Verbot stops Russia actually from borrowing in Germany in 1887. So there are some earlier kind of interventions in the debt markets that constitute that. But I would also emphasize that what's really important for the efficacy of sanctions then and now is that it's not only about government policy, it's also about what the private sector considers to be a creditworthy borrower. And Italy, actually, there are never financial sanctions, there are some financial sanctions against Italy in 1935, but they don't cut off any financing because banks in the City of London had already stopped lending to Italy months before. Italy is simply not considered to be a creditworthy borrower, so there's already a private boycott that's effectively in place. And so, yeah, I think that the interactions there are important. Yeah.
Well, I love the argument on sort of calibrating the punishment of Italy because you ultimately are more worried about Turkey. But I didn't understand the calibration, the complications of calibration with Germany, because why not just overshoot? Let's say you were doing it too rough. Was there ultimately a sense that better over the Bolsheviks, or what was keeping the Allies from just saying, okay, we can miscalibrate, but like let's overshoot because we need to punish him for clear violations of Versailles and rearmament before Czechoslovakia.
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would say two things. One is a kind of actual a macroeconomic reason, which is that for most European countries, Germany is their largest trading partner. And it's precisely this problem that Hirschman identified as well in 1941, that's what Germany after 1933 begins to really exploit. It supplies industrial machinery to virtually every small European agrarian economy. So these countries can maybe cut off Italy, because Italy doesn't really supply anything that other countries don't have, save its nice clothing and apparel perhaps, but people can do without that, even in the 30s. But Germany, you cannot have sanctions simultaneously against Italy and Germany. They're the 7th and the 3rd largest economies in the world in the late 30s. And that would immediately, it is feared, launch Europe or push it back into the Great Recession, the Great Depression it's just emerged from. So that's one. And the other thing that's really striking, particularly in Britain and France, you're right, that there is actually, and Jonathan Haslam has recently made this argument too, in his new book, The Spectre of War, there is a reluctance actually in London and Paris to impose sanctions on Mussolini and Hitler that would lead to their regimes to collapse. They want sanctions that will stop them from invading, but they're not interested in changing government precisely because they're worried that communists will benefit from this. Yeah, exactly. And they have plans, for example, to put imports, to sever imports of textiles, so cotton, and which is half the workforce in Italy and a third of the workforce in Germany, but they're considered socially too disruptive because if you drive up unemployment to 30%, the communists will benefit. And that is what Chamberlain and Daladier are even more worried about. And oh, sorry.
Sure. I love the book as well. I really admire it. I had a similar question, but maybe the flip side of the story, which is sanctions also cost the sanctions. And whether that figures in, I'm just ripping on you guys. I have a small empirical question and just a more general one. Which is the empirical one is, when Mussolini was planning, was he anticipating sanctions? Thinking about your time gains, how much does one internalize the potential hazards? Just of course, perhaps how much sanctions have entered the zeitgeist of expansion. The general question is, and I remember about halfway through the book, it creeps up. You have a line that says something to the effect that humanitarian aid is the flip side of sanctions. And it slips in. It's kind of a subtle through line. And I want to ask you whether that's because that's something that people discover halfway through the history of the experience as they're muddling through, figuring out what this model of managing conflict states would look like, or whether that's something there at the beginning. And I wasn't sure. In this dialectic, let's say, between the negative and the positive sides of the sanction situation.
Thank you. Yeah. So empirically on Mussolini, he actually begins preparations for the invasion of Ethiopia in 1933. So 2 years beforehand. And the strange thing is that he thinks of this also as a work creation scheme, which is why he brings more than 150,000 Italian workers to East Africa, that it's going to prevent revolution at home by kind of exporting surplus labor and launching this sort of neo-colonial venture. He did anticipate sanctions. He had built up reserves, but he had also laid down red lines that he tried to enforce basically through bluster. And one of the crucial things that wasn't never done is to simply that France and Britain could have closed the Suez Canal, which forces the boats to go all the way around. There's not enough fuel. It really throws a big wrench in the whole war machine. But the Suez Company is a private company. And there's actually a treaty going back to the 1880s, an old Ottoman era treaty that says that it is neutral and cannot be politically exploited, a bit like the Dardanelles as well, right? So it's international law actually that is also a problem here. But Mussolini says if the Suez Canal is closed, I'm going to go to war in the Mediterranean. And then there's basically, that's a line that they're not willing to risk because they're precisely aiming to discipline him while keeping him potentially in a future anti-Hitler coalition. And yeah, the Ethiopian war is also really important for this point that you mentioned on the positive economic weapons. So that does come right from World War I itself already. The inter-allied logistics bodies, Jamie Martin is coming out with a book this summer that's very much about that, kind of the credit and logistical provision side and developmental provision side of the League of Nations also. Keynes, Jean Monnet are all involved in this. And it's that experience that's also thought of as, you can deprive countries of resources, but you can also share them. And particularly, you can funnel resources to the victim of aggression while you deprive the aggressor of those same resources. And in World War II, this becomes really a question of, when the Lend-Lease program kicks in, diverting oil tankers from the US that were going to Japan just to Vladivostok because you want to give it to the Soviet Union that's now in Lend-Lease, and they were going to go to Japan. So it's really just shifting the shipping route a few hundred kilometers north, but it's still US oil. Right, so provision and deprivation are really umbilically linked. There's a few other cases, smaller countries that I discussed.
You say the turning point is that if the First World War
Yeah.
pulled the veil up on sanctionism, that side of the war.
Yeah, I think it's the 40s, because I think it also requires a shift in economic thinking. It requires, in a way, kind of I mean, for lack of a better word, the Keynesian understanding that you can reflate the world economy by ramping up spending and production in the late 30s. US war industry is the material basis, I think, for a lot of the re-expansion of the world in the world economy in the 40s. And there is an attempt to institutionalize this assistance provision mechanism. The treaty is signed. There's basically the League of Nations will go to the Swiss central bank and borrow on behalf of victims and give that money. So that's all planned out. Keynes is a big supporter, important City of London financiers, but it's shelved because of a combination of austerity thinking in the 30s, basically, and yeah, this broader mood of international distrust. So I think that is actually a story that is tied to the rise of US hegemony and just the raw productive power also of the US wartime state in the 40s, that it just, yeah, and Lend-Lease is kind of the material arm of that, because it just floods every single continent with enormous amounts of American material. Yeah.
I had a question I wanted to ask as well. The book highlights this really interesting tension I wanted to press you a little bit more about. But on the one hand, in a more globalized economy, sanctions become more powerful. But yet, on the other hand, the use of sanctions itself creates this such a phrase of push to autarky.
Mm-hmm.
So it sort of undermines the globalization that it exploits, and there's this sort of tension between those points. And maybe this is a little bit of an unfair question to ask you, but I wondered whether you want to speculate about that in terms of today's conflict between Russia and Ukraine, and in terms of China-US relations, in the sense that already in recent years, Russia has tried to insulate itself to some degree. China has tried to develop its own payment system, with less success, but both in Russia and China's case, limited success, but both have tried to. And so I wanted you to kind of speculate a little bit more. Sanctions seems a very easy tool. We can use it. No one has to fight. No one has to die in direct conflict. But yet it also brings these costs that kind of undermines globalization. And I wonder whether you had any thoughts about decoupling and sort of the present global economy.
Yeah. Well, I'll just say very briefly, and then we can talk more about it later. But I think what's, the levels of globalization that we are witnessing today are several orders of magnitude larger still than in the early 20th century, which opens up new opportunities. And I think in China's case, for example, there's an interesting ambiguity between the incredible level of Chinese economic integration, which is clearly like proximity, right? Like boxers kind of clinching each other in a fight. You can't hit the other boxer when you're clinching them right up close. So incredibly tight integration provides them a level of protection because it makes the costs so mutual that it's effectively kind of self-destructive. The way I also have recently started to think about the sanctions on Russia is that what Russia's vulnerability was precisely that it entered this space of medium levels of integration, where it was dependent on Western high technology and capital, but was not so autarkic as, say, North Korea, that it could afford essentially a total embargo against it. So, but the costs, right, of sanctions on Russia are quite minimal to the United States. So that's the other thing I think. The irony is that the United States is a very quite autarkic country in many ways, is already thought of in that way, and even in the late 19th century already, throughout this whole period. But this actually gives it both the ability to withstand that pressure, but also to use it against others without suffering blowback to its own economy, which is remarkable. And like European and Asian economies in that sense truly are different. They're much more open and in terms of value chain and interconnected. So they don't have the political economies that are suitable actually for sanctions use. And I think that's something Europe is very much running into right now. They've become only more trade dependent since the Eurozone crisis. They've all become current account. Virtually, I think 24, 25 of the Eurozone economies, 15 out of the 19 Eurozone economies are current account surplus economies, right? That's, you're setting yourself up to really cut into your own flesh when you then start to cut off all trade with the major trading partner. So the United States has, in that sense, strength precisely because of its domestic demand, the role of that play in its own economy. There's more over there, yeah.
Go ahead. Feel free to come down to the microphone. The gentleman in the middle.
Sure. Yeah, thanks for speaking. I heard you speak on the Eurotrash podcast.
Oh.
That's on Jaeger and that's on the Blizzard. Great podcast. I was wondering if you could talk about maybe from either perspective, but maybe I'm more interested in the sanctionist perspective of just like how economic sanctions can start off as trying to produce a certain change in a country, but then just become stuck as a kind of permanent or indefinite fixture.
Mm-hmm.
You got examples like Cuba, Iran, North Korea that just like gone indefinitely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that the context that I would try and understand that tendency towards the ossification of sanctions in is the broadening of its goals from the 1940s onwards, that as sanctions become tools with which we're trying to attain way more goals, they come to be seen as more important, more all-encompassing, more ambitious, right? When you try and pursue a change in government in another country, that's a much bigger demand also to pose than simply enforcing a small treaty or saying that country needs to shift one particular policy. So I would say that that is one thing. It has to do with the size of the ambition and the investment also that democracies and all countries, but particularly democracies, have in pursuing and enforcing those values. The other thing is that there is a political economy that emerges once sanctions are in place, right? That tends to keep them in place. The lifting part is, I think, the area where if I had more resources and time now, I would be focusing all my research on sanctions lifting, because I think it presents a whole plethora of really interesting questions, both why there's such resistance to it, what sort of ways it can be done to increase the efficacy of sanctions, precisely by making the prospect of lifting more credible, right? The sort of behavioral incentive is much higher. And one of the things we see now is that with these sanctions on Russia, 400 plus companies have left. Even if, say, European countries all decide against the will of most of their publics probably to lift sanctions on Russia as part of a peace deal, the question is if the international corporate sector will return, right? And if they don't, what is the material benefit of the sanctions lifting if there is no corporate return also, right? So the question is raised also about sort of state business relations, I think, are really key and point, I think, towards all sorts of new ways of thinking about collaboration, intervention, stimulus, reconstruction, recovery, assistance, those sorts of policies. Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, thank you so much. I had a couple of questions. First is so I think right now there's this like debate and discussion about like sanctions and the dollar, like you need the dollar to be the reserve currency for them to be effective, but also maybe overuse might undercut that. And I'm wondering for you, writing about the origin of sanctions under a different monetary system, if that like taught you anything about how to think about the relationship between sanctions and the dollar. And then my second question was about your comment about case-by-case basis. And I'm wondering how you think about like the importance of looking at every single sanctions case as on a case-by-case basis, as opposed to the need for countries to think about like their whole sanction regime, every single country that they're sanctioning, and how that might impact flows more generally. So yeah, just
Yes, both great questions. So on the dollar issue, there's obviously a lot of talk about that, and I kind of agree with the skeptics if the original argument is that this is a threat to dollar reserve currency status. I think that that's definitely overblown. There's a lot of network effects, right, and a lot of private sector demand that even if governments change their orientation, will continue in that regard. I do think the picture is more mixed when it comes to dollar as a trade invoicing currency. I think there is quite a lot of potential and already a tendency towards diversification. And in that sense, I think what the interwar period shows, interestingly, is if you look at these League of Nations World Economic Surveys from the 30s, they start to use this interesting language because in the wake of the gold standard, the big division in the international monetary system is between countries that continue to have freely convertible currencies that can buy and sell each other's currencies through things like the tripartite agreement, so against set exchange rates, or that actually proceed on an entirely bilateral barter trade quota system basis, so kind of controlled versus freely convertible currencies. The democracies, by and large, are freely convertible. The dictatorships, the more totalitarian states, are more controlled. I actually think that that is something that we might be, that is a potential outcome, where again, it doesn't change the fact that the dollar is the prime freely convertible currency of the world, but you will start to see more and more countries on crucial trade issues doing it purely bilaterally, bilateral clearing. I think that that's, and it won't challenge the dollar status as a first among equals or even as a dominant currency. It will simply mean that more of the world economy is proceeding on a different, more kind of country by country basis. So I guess that also leads into your second question a little bit, which is how to think about this as a whole. One of the issues is just that, even talking about sanctions in general, it has something a bit deceptive about it, because of course, again, all these sanctions regimes are so specific also, and some of them can have very similar effects. But for example, Venezuela, there's no general all-encompassing trade embargo. There's only a targeted sanction against the state oil company and a bunch of other things. But state oil exports are 90% of Venezuela's trade. So the effect of it is still very total. So I think that, there's kind of the legal reality, and that's also the issue with, I think, quantifying in these graphs by IR and PoliSci researchers sanctions use, because they go to the OFAC listing of the Treasury and they sort of list the designations, but the designations don't give you a good, they're legal designations. They don't give you a good sense of the material impact. So if someone could come up with a way of sort of like using a material quotient or something for each designation to scale it more to its actual material size, I think that would be great. It would give a much better sense of that question. Yeah.
Yeah, do we have any questions from the audience?
Yeah, I was just about to ask, do you have any Q&A online? I was trying to download yourself.
Oh yeah. I guess I can click on it, or aha. So is there any reason to believe that the threat of sanctions has lost its potency a century later? So the threat question, I think, is really interesting. We just tried and failed to use the threat in the case of Russia, but I do think that there are cases where it does work. I think the Trump administration actually against Turkey did manage to, by just sort of brute threats and intimidation, get them to release a pastor, and took some pretty minor actions against the lira that had a significant effect. So there are some cases. I do think that points to a deeper thing, which is that one of the other ironies that sanctions researchers found is that it's very effective to use sanctions against your own allies. So if you have a country that is really committed to keeping good economic relations, that gives you true leverage. If the threat will work much less against a country you're already on an antagonistic footing towards. So yeah, I would say that is a crucial background factor. And let's see what the other one is. Given scope and skill of sanctions imposed on Russia and Ukraine, how can we contextualize them versus historical example in terms of severity? And so yeah, the severity question. I mean, I kind of inserted a little bit more of the similarities between the Italo-Ethiopian case and the Russo-Ukrainian case, which I think are really quite striking in many regards. It is difficult to think about severity also because right now, we're talking about an embargo on Russian exports, which would be similar to the League embargo on Italian exports. But Italy, there were additional measures like an oil embargo against Italy. So that was actually an import severance of what Italy could import. To a country like Italy, if you import 98% of your fuel, that's really dramatic. Russia doesn't have those sorts of raw material vulnerabilities, self-sufficient in food and energy. So that already, you could argue that makes it less severe. I think that's also one of the issues with comparisons of like the Japanese oil embargo. People have made that, as a cautionary comparison, that are we driving Russia towards a Japanese 1941 style escalation? I do think we should study that case and be aware of that sort of dynamic. But hopefully the fact that Russia actually doesn't have a direct dependence on those things gives us some more room. But I mean, that's still something I think that's an open question, right? At some point, there will be a point where you are going to tip over into an escalatory scenario. But yeah, that the issue is where it is basically. Yeah.
I just want to follow up about that with the last question. We're getting short on time, but that last point is very interesting. It also connects back with the point you made earlier about calibration. But the sort of danger, at what point does sanctions tip over into war? And Russia and Ukraine is a particularly interesting situation because not only are we imposing, is the West imposing sanctions on Russia, but it's also helping Ukraine. And there seems to be this sort of agreement that some forms of military aid are sort of acceptable and that they're not going to escalate, but other forms of military aid
Yes.
are unacceptable because they will escalate.
Yeah.
And so both in terms of helping Ukraine, and also in terms of how far this will go with Russia, there seems to be this sort of calibration issue. It's exactly the right level. And particularly with Russia, one thing that's very different from Germany in the 30s is, of course, that Russia is a nuclear state. And so the potential scale of response is much different. So it also seems like re-emphasize and make all the more important the point we were making earlier about calibration. It's very, very hard with sanctions to know what is the right level.
Yeah. Well, I should make one sort of optimistic point on the comparison also again between Russia, Ukraine, and Italy and Ethiopia, which is that the big thing that was not done was to support Ethiopia materially in its defense. And that is something that we have now very much done with Ukraine. So I think that's already important.
It does go to the league.
Right. Right. Exactly. And it's where he's heckled from by Italian journalists from the side. Exactly. So there's actually a demand by the Ethiopians for serious financial assistance, but the league again doesn't act on it. I think that's a much different thing. So if that means that I think that the best way of thinking about de-escalation is that you should use as broad a spectrum of tools as possible, including preparedness to talk, but including military and economic. And if you can keep that spectrum broad, I think that you're in a safer space than when you are very reliant on singular things. And I think that's what kind of worries me about the dynamic where the diplomatic preparedness to come to an agreement, even potentially, is quite limited. The nuclear kinetic options are off the table because of the nuclear escalation risk. And so all of the expectations for ending the conflict go into the economic pressure realm. And I think that is something that potentially, that does worry me. So I feel that like if you can keep that spectrum open, you could be much more flexible in how you ratchet pressure effectively. So I would say that's an important thing to preserve. Yeah.
Thank you. Great talk, man. Really wonderful stuff. I want to ask about the definite article in your title. There are other economic weapons besides sanctions.
Right.
And so do you think that by framing it in that way, that policymakers have sort of narrowed their arsenal of other kind of non-military choices to deal with these sorts of issues? Because it seems, I mean, you strike me as sort of someone deeply immersed in sanctions, but somewhat of a sanctions skeptic, from what I've seen in your commentary on current events. So I'm wondering whether that label has sort of led us down a path that forecloses other economic options.
Yes, I think the short answer is yes, and I think that's where the emphasis on positive assistance, right, on the carrot as well as the stick is important. So I guess if I come across as a skeptic, it's not just the historical record, but also the sense that our options or our impulses to use this tool have really narrowed, and those lines between a situation and our use of it have gotten much shorter. And that there is actually a lot to be achieved. And I think one just very basic thing is that this whole issue with Russia and Ukraine in 2013-14 on Maidan did begin over economic integration and the potential aid that Europe could offer to Ukraine. And also the fact that, Russia doesn't have much of an economic future beyond hydrocarbons, sees that, I think, as an existential issue as well. So to me, at least, like whatever outcome there is possible in the future will also have to involve that. And, thinking about Ukraine as a kind of developmental failure since 1990, right? Its per capita GDP still being below its 1990 level. Those are serious those are serious things one must focus on if we want to build up an independent Ukraine that can avoid falling into this situation. So, and I think focusing on that also, Russia doesn't have the resources actually even to do that. So there's no future in that path of annexation at all, right? Besides obviously its moral odiousness, but it's just also not an economic solution, I think. So that's what I find refreshing about the interwar period, that there was a much stronger sense that material prosperity and shocks to it have geopolitical consequences and a kind of discourse. And E.H. Carr actually, for some of his wrong predictions and moves, was quite good on that. So I hope that's a sufficient answer. Yeah.
Thanks very much, Nick. Thank you for this terrific.
Thank you.